Well, good morning and welcome to Flatiron. My name is Brian. If I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, I'm the lead pastor. And what we're going to be doing today is in the second of our series, Comfort Zone. Last week we looked at calling, and this week what we're going to be looking at is the idea of provision. Does the Lord provide in those seasons and those times where we're fearful? Does He come through in those moments when we're a little bit scared to move forward in faith? And so today is likely going to hit on just all those right pieces of comfort, because I know some of you guys and I know some of your stories are really, this is where you're at right now. Will the Lord meet the need that I have? Let's go ahead and stand. We're going to read today from Genesis chapter 13, verses 1 through 18. The reason we do this is just to give deference to the Lord and His Word, and it just seems right, seems fitting to stand and read His Word. Verse 1, chapter 13. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and in gold, and he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And at that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. And Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zorah. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. And Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land that you see I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." So Abram moved his tent, and he came and he settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. You may be seated. So we're dealing with the life of Abram, later named Abraham, and we're going to be in his life for the next 2 weeks as we look at this series called Comfort Zone. The idea behind this is seeing how does God's provision meet and equip and enable Abram today in our passage. A number of years ago, before I was married to Melinda, I was in several dating relationships for a season. That's typically how this goes. Most people, I've heard of stories, you find the person, you marry the person, one and done, right? But for most, there's a bit of a journey of who am I going to end up with, who I'm going to date, and we're going to try to figure out if this works. Well, I was in a relationship that really was not great. It was one of those where it's like, is it me, is it her? It was mostly me, right? I'm just kind of an idiot at that point in my life, basically. And yet I kind of knew, I was like, the Lord is not really opening the doors for this one. I just had a stirring in my heart that this was not going to be the person I should marry or will marry. And if you've ever had that thought and you're in the relationship, that's where the danger flag starts to arise, right? Because all of a sudden now you've got a hard conversation you have to have. Now you've got to be like, hey, I need to tell you, I need to inform you, I think we need to end this. Well, at that season of my life, that's where the moment was. I knew I needed to end things, but I didn't. A month went by. Things got better? No, things always get worse. Once you know you need to end it, things just continually slide down until there's enough tension or enough things afraid that it forces the conversation. But here's what was going on in my heart. In my heart, I didn't believe that God would provide something better. Have you ever been there? You're in something that's altogether not great, but you're struggling to believe that God will meet you on the other side of that surrender with a greater provision. You're thinking, well, I know this isn't good, but at least it's something. Some of you guys are looking at me saying, help, that's where I'm at right now. Some of you know you've walked through that season. Others of you, you're dealing with it, and maybe it's not in the relational tension, but you're dealing with it finances. You've got a job, it's not great, but you're scared or fearful to move on, to take that step of faith, to start the business, to move outside of the state, to get away from family, whatever it may be. There's things that are pushing or hemming you in, and you're wondering, will God meet me if I surrender this to him? Here's where we're going this morning. We tend to surrender as much as we think God will provide. I know. It's like right between the eyes, right? We do. We tend to surrender as much as we think God will provide. So if you're thinking that God's provision is large, then you will surrender much. If you're thinking God's provision is small, what you surrender before him is small. Here's why this is so important, is that the Lord is the ultimate provider. And yet we live as though we're better providers than he. Well, I'm going to look at Abram's life because I'm just not going to ask you to raise your hand every time something's convicting you. But here's what we're going to do. We'll look at Abram's life, but you're going to see that Abram has some responses and Lot has some responses. And if we're being honest, I think most of us tend to respond like Lot, but I'll let the Lord sort that out. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver and gold. He journeyed on from the Negev, which is the southernmost tip of Israelites' borders and boundaries, as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. That is, when he first walked through the land, we looked at this last week, he set up an altar outside of Bethel in between these two places. So now he's making his way back up to the place that he had made an altar at first, and there he calls upon the name of the Lord. Things are good. Life is okay, but trouble's on the horizon. Lot, who went with Abram, that is his nephew, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great, they were so blessed, they could not dwell together. And there was, here's a key word, strife between herdsmen of Abram and the herdsmen of Lot. Have you ever had those moments? Strife hits. Maybe it is within that relational tension, kind of like I was describing within that relationship where there was strife, there was things that I knew needed to probably be resolved by us breaking up. But I was struggling to make that move. Other times there's tension pieces when it comes to, walking away from a job that is providing well for something that you know God's calling you to. Sometimes it's staying in a job that you don't want to do because you feel like the Lord is calling you to it. It can work both ways. But a lot of times strife happens. Something begins to break down. I see this all the time when it comes to friendships as well. You're in a friendship, and it's probably not the greatest friendship for you if you're being honest. This is a person that when you get around, the decisions you collectively make are not great. And yet you continue to stay in that friendship long past its season. Others of you, you come into a space like this and you've got ideals of what you want your friendships to be. People that you'd like to be around, friendships you'd like to cultivate. And then you find out that those that are placed around you or in your life group or in your serving team don't match you. They're weird. They're not the kind of people you'd like to watch sports with. And yet that seems to be the people God has you around. And you're like, well, what gives? Sometimes the Lord is going to have you make interesting friendships that in the end make a lot more sense than they do in the beginning. There are some people in my life who early on, I did not see how this was going to work. And yet they've come to be some of my dearest friends. In fact, people literally on the staff, that's how that started. Where is it for you that you find you fail to surrender or struggle to surrender? There's strife, there's something happening. Now take a look with me, because this is what Abram does, and I think how Abram responds here is ideal. I think that he's looking at a situation, there's problems going on, there's something that he's going to do that I think is pivotal that we struggle to, most of us struggle to. He says this, "Then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen, we are of one family. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me and take the left, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right, I will go to the left." What Abram does here is interesting. He doesn't jockey for position. He doesn't go to Lot and say, hey, you came with me. Technically, all of this is mine anyways. No, he gives a choice. And by giving Lot a choice, look what he's doing. By giving Lot a choice, he's giving the choice to God. He's saying, I see that there's conflict happening. I see that there's clouds on the horizon. I see that how we navigate this season is going to impact how our families move forward. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the choice. I'm going to take the position of surrendering what any right or whatever right I had, and I'm going to lay it before God. Now, what's amazing about this is how quickly he seems to come to this conclusion. For me, I struggle with this because I'm constantly thinking, how do I need to defend myself? How do I need to prepare for myself? How do I make sure my provisions are secure? I stay in something longer than I should because I'm worried, will God really meet me on the other side? Fundamentally, that's why that relationship continued far longer than it should have. I knew long before I made the decision to leave, I knew I should not be in it. But I worried, will God genuinely provide something better? And so often we cling to things that we know aren't good because we doubt that God is better. We don't give the choice to him. Now this is Abram. But what I want to do is I want to show you Lot, because I think his response, at least for me, as your pastor, this tends to be how I operate instinctively, and then I have to allow the Word of God to wash over my heart. Take a look with me. Lot lifts up his eyes. He sees that the Jordan Valley was well watered. I don't know if you've noticed, but water is very important when you're in a desert, is it not? Right? Very important. If you're going to feed things, if you're going to have crops, if you're going to water those crops, if you're going to give water to your animals, you need water. So he's looking around, and again, Abram's giving him the choice. You go to the left, I'll go to the right. You go to the right, I'll go to the left. He's giving the choice. So what does he do? He lifts up his eyes. Now notice that phrase too, because you're going to see that again. Lot lifts up his eyes. What can I see? What can I see? And everywhere there's a garden of the Lord. This is like the Garden of Eden. This is abundance. This is bounty. This is beauty. It's like the land of Egypt. When you think Egypt, think of the delta that forms right outside of the Nile as it goes into the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah, literally today you could go onto Google Maps satellite image. It's dry desert, and all of a sudden this delta of green opens up right where Egypt enters the Mediterranean. The direction of Zoar, this is a comment from our narrator, this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, why is that important? Well, you're going to see shortly. Lot chooses for himself the Jordan. Abram gives him the choice. The land's before you. Which do you want? Lot lifts up his eyes with his own ability, scans the land. He sees water. He sees provision. He sees all the things that are going to be necessary for him to take hold of. And he chooses. What's interesting with Lot is there's no sense that we see from the text that he asked for God's opinion. There's no sense from the text that Lot paused and prayed. There's also no sense from the text that he asked for wise counsel. All we see with Lot is what we so often do. We raise our eyes and we look and we see. And that's how we make the decision. When I'm in that relationship and I know it needs to end, I'm looking around. I'm saying, well, there's not much better else out there, so I'll stay in here. That's great. Everyone loves to hear that story, right? Happens all the time. Why? Because we tend to live by sight. And there's a reason for that, guys. Take a look with me. We're tempted to seek provision apart from surrender to God. When we lift up our eyes and we look around, our greatest temptation is to trust this more than to trust him. Some of us stay in jobs far too long. Some of us never serve with our time because we're far too stingy, because we don't believe that he'll meet the needs. We apply this to our money as well. We don't give, and you're like, hey, Brian, if you knew my bank account, you'd understand why. It's like, I genuinely wouldn't understand why. Because when I was our poorest, that's when we started the process of giving faithfully. It didn't start when I had more. And that's how most of life works. Guys, we build the habits when it's small. And you'll remain faithful as things grow. Lot did a very calculated choice, and I just want to show this on a map because I think a lot of times you can look at these things and just think, it's ancient, old days, and they don't even exist anymore. No, they very much do exist. Take a look with me. Right outside of Jerusalem, just north of there, was where they were standing. And as he looks down and he sees this valley, the Dead Sea's right there, this area, which today is now very desiccated, very desert-like, there's very dry, this area was teeming with life. Fertile, green, massive civilizations. In fact, they've done archaeological digs there, and they've seen that there were city after city after city right in this plain of Zorah. And then one event happened, it seemed to knock all the cities out, and there was never another city that grew on top of it. I wonder what happened. If you go there today, it's nothing but desiccated desert, nothing's living. But when Lot looked up, what he saw is beauty, provision, security. And you know what Abram saw? Hills, mountains, things that would be harder to cultivate crops on, things that would be harder to build a thriving civilization on. So Lot made the choice that many of us would make. He saw with his own eyes, and he made the choice. But here's the problem. When we live life like this, you and me, when we live life like this, what we tend to fail to see are how those immediate decisions play into God's plan. Look with me. Abram settled in the land of Canaan. Lot settled in the cities among the valley. And he moved his tent as far as Sodom. That is, he's going right into the thick of this green, lush valley. But notice something. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Lot could see with his eyes provision, but what he couldn't see were the hearts of what was going to happen to his family. About a month and a half ago, I unpacked the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I talked about how Lot, making this one critical decision, changed the course of his family forever. He would lose his wife because of this. He would lose any kind of family relation outside of his own daughters because of this. An entire generation of people would come from his line now that would oppose Israel moving forward. Based on one decision that he saw with his eyes. Things look green, I can have provision, I can have security, and I can have it without surrender. You and I, when we live this way, what we're inviting are things in the future that we can't see. Things that have a cost, things that our future generations will pay. Proverbs says it this way, 14:12. It says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death." When you and I live by sight, when we live not surrendered before the Lord, but trusting and trying for our own provision and not heeding his call, not laying it down, not giving up what he's called us to, be it time, money, or friendships, but we hold on to those things thinking, nope, we're going to be the one that makes it, we're going to be the one. It seems right in the moment, it seems lush and fertile and green, and its way leads to death. And here's where Flatiron, it gets very serious because it's not as though he's giving us an option on this. He's not saying, well, somewhat trust me. No. There is those who live in obedience and they lay it before him and surrender, and there is those who hold on. And as long as you hold on, you are denying the provision of the very God that can give and bless in greater abundance than you and I could ever imagine. Take a look what happens with Abram. Remember that man that I said most of us don't think like him? At least not immediately? The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated, he says, "Lift up your eyes." Do you remember that phrase? Lot lifted up his eyes on his own volition. Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw what he could see. Here you're seeing the Lord saying, Abram, lift up your eyes and see what only I can show you. How many of us live lifting our eyes, seeing what we see, never lifting our eyes to see what only God can show? He says, look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. All that you see, I will what? I will give. Whose hand gives? Whose hand provides? Whose hand meets you in the gap? Whose hand says, you know what, I know this is a treacherous path. I'm calling you to walk it, and I'm with you. Whose hand says, invest your time because I'm going to do something with that you could never do on your own? Whose hand says, release your finance and your money to me and let me be the one that worries that over it? Whose hand actually walks with us as it says, let go of what you think is going to provide for you and trust where I'm calling you? Men and women of Flatiron, are you starting to catch it? We oftentimes look with our own eyes and what we can see, and we make the decisions. In that moment, I wish I could go back to Brian of 20 years old and say, Brian, you don't see what God has for you. You don't see the provision He's providing you. You don't see what mistake would make if you choose to move forward with this relationship. You don't see it. Because in that moment, I didn't see it. Because in that moment, it's not as though God lays out His whole plan before us and says, hey, walk by sight. No, He says, walk by faith and believe I have a plan. And yet you and I were asking for that plan. We're constantly saying, no, just show it to me, God. Just show me the plan. He's saying, no. You must live trusting I provide for you. Trusting that I'm going to be the hand that gives and feeds and protects and restores. Because here's the thing, I could tell myself that at 20, but myself at 20 wouldn't have believed me. How do I know? Because I had faithful men that told me that. Two guys in particular. One of them was my father. I'll never forget. He looked at me and he said, Brian, in 20 years you're going to have to wake up to your own reality. I said, that's a scary thought. Because I don't want to wake up tomorrow with that reality. If it sounds like I'm being harsh, I'm trying to be honest. The other one was a young man. I talked about him a couple weeks ago. He was inviting me to live with him in what was a condemned barn house. I didn't know that. I just thought it was a house. $100 a month, though. You should probably ask some questions. And he's inviting me in. And I'm thinking, do I want to go live with that guy for $100 a month or stay in this miserable relationship? And God in His grace removed me. And He taught me this lesson. And I'll be honest, I'm not perfect from this moment on. It's not like I haven't lingered in things that I should let go of. But fundamentally, what He showed me at 20 is He's a provider. He's a better provider than I could ever be. And it started to build within me a sense of I'm going to aim to move forward to just surrendering versus trying to withhold. I'm going to aim to move forward to surrender as fast as I can because I'm starting to learn He's a better provider than I could ever be. Men and women of Flatiron, I'm asking you, where right now are you struggling to surrender? Where right now are those things you're just wrestling with God? Time, money, relationships. Usually tends to be in one of those three buckets. Sometimes it's health. But it usually tends to be in one of those three buckets where He's calling you to something. And you're fighting Him. You're saying, no, I think I got a better plan. It looks green over here. And there's surrounding villages. And there's lush vegetation. And there's provision here. And I have security here. And I know my way here. And there's path here. And He's looking at you saying, where you're heading is the equivalent of Sodom. And what you're going to destroy is your own future. Would you, like Abram, lift your eyes and let Him be the one that fills in the sight? None of what I'm saying is easy. All of what I'm saying is good. I'll say that again. None of what I'm asking you to do is easy. All of what God is asking you to do is good. Okay. So how do we respond to this big idea? Well, the first thing is we do. We tend to give. We tend to surrender as much as we think God will provide. Where is your vision of God this big? How do I know? Because that's what you're surrendering. Your vision of God is this big because you give this much time, this big because you give this much money, this big because you purposely pour into people that are and are not like you. How do we move forward then? You're probably thinking with me, well then how in the world do we move forward? Well, the first thing is, I need us to recognize that when we respond, we're not responding with our own strength. Take a look with me in verse 16. I will make you your offspring as the dust of the earth so that it can be counted. If one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can be counted. He says this, he says, arise and walk. The first step in this journey of laying it down and surrendering is get up and move. Get up and move. Now that your heart and your mind are starting to be undone by his word, he's telling each of us, get up and move in response to that. I've just shown you what I'm going to provide. Get up and move. And so often it can be easy to think and have those moments, those epiphany-like moments where there's clarity and we're like, okay, we're going to trust God. And then we walk out of church and nothing happens. Because the tyranny of the urgent hits us and all of a sudden our mind's on to other things. Arise and walk. But the second is also important. Abraham moved his tent. He came, he settled by the oaks of Mamre. And there he what? Built an altar to the Lord. It's not just walking, it's also your worship. Where are you choosing to commune in his word? Allowing it to wash over you daily. That's why we push the Bible reading plan so hard. That's why we have bookmarks in the connection point saying, hey, pick one up, put it in, and start the plan. Why? Why allow the word? Because the word is what's going to wash over you. It's what's going to remind you again of what is true, of how he is a provider, and it's going to strengthen you to trust in him when everything in you, and maybe even those around you, are saying to trust yourself. What does it look like to worship the Lord? To me, it's a mixture of word and prayer and people. His word is a daily habit that washes over you. Prayer. Some of you guys are praying types of people. Some of you struggle with prayer. I'm more in the latter half. I'm more in the person who's just like, if it's urgent and needed, I'm leading the baton on prayer. But otherwise, I tend to be such a doer. I'm going for it. Bible makes sense to me because I like to read and I like to slot it into my calendar. I'm not saying all of us are going to be proficient at doing Bible and prayer like it's like not going to be the greatest gifts of everyone, but you do have to be faithful to say, Lord, where have you called me to lay down so that I can get that time back so I can pour it with you? His people. Why do I want people in life group? Why do I want people communing with each other? Not just walking out of here, running out of here, but actually joining teams. Part of that is just for you to build friendships, intentional friendships, that you don't know what the Lord's going to do with that. How he's going to move in you and move on others, some of whom you will like and some of whom you can't imagine would ever be your friend. And yet he's doing it for what? His glory and his purpose. Because he's saving a people unto himself. You and I are a people unto himself. This is his church. It gives him glory when he sees his children moving in concert together. And so you and I, the way that we respond to this is will we walk and will we worship? The path of surrender is walking and worship. Will you lay down where you're tempted to pull back? I've got a quick video of a gal who got baptized in our church last year. And it's one of those videos that I think will strike at the heart of some of what you guys are feeling. If I can just be honest, she shares some stuff that I think some men and women in this congregation are still likely going through. And I want it to encourage you as you think about this idea of surrender. Let's go ahead and roll that video really quick.
My name is Jenna, and I've been going to Flatiron a little over a year now. From a very young age, I never really felt like I was enough, and I never had a sense of community. My mom took me to church just for a very short time, Christian church. And I remember when she did, that was probably when I felt the most alive, and I was just a little girl. And, I'd stand on the benches and I'd praise Jesus, and I loved it. And then at some point she just stopped taking us. It was just really hard. I had challenges I feel like a lot of people didn't. My mom was a single mom and she struggled. I didn't have a real dad, and he was an addict. My mom was an addict, but she had been clean since I was 8, so I really didn't know any difference with her other than her being clean. At some point in my life, I found drugs that gave me that sense of relief where I felt like I didn't need to love myself or need that from other people. I got very angry with God because it kind of felt like he abandoned me. I didn't understand like why I had to have this addiction and why me. And I kept trying to get clean and trying to get clean and trying to get clean. And I realized through that time, like I always believed in God, but I never really put the effort in my relationship with God. I believed in him and that's all I knew. I want to say though, the point where I truly knew God existed for me, when I got clean, I met the love of my life. His name was Christopher, and we had a little boy together, and he died from drugs. And I'll never forget the moment it happened. And when I found out, I had, fallen to my knees, and that craving of wanting to use came back. And at this point, I had been clean about, I want to say, a year. And when that craving came back, it was the strongest it had ever been in my whole life. That desire to use, to not feel, to not be in pain, to not suffer. I just remember falling to my knees and, screaming. And I said, okay, God, like, I need you now. Like, if there is a time I've ever needed you, it's right now. And I just fully collapsed, and all of a sudden, that craving was just gone. Like, that desire to use drugs again was just gone. And it never came back. Because I was very much in fear of that my addiction would take over again, and it didn't. And I was so not happy for so many years without God in my life and Jesus, and it was really sad that I didn't love myself then. And I think it's really beautiful that I love myself today and I'm happy. And for me, it would have been that moment that I lost my son's father, when God truly showed me his mercy for me. I was suffering and in pain, and he relieved me of that pain. That's what God has done in my life. And, it's funny because I thought also getting baptized, I think like most people do, all your problems are going to go away. And I think my biggest fear was if I sinned after being baptized, that's it, I was immediately going to hell. Like, that was one of my biggest thoughts. Like, I don't want to get baptized because then it's for sure. Like, if I sin, it's all over. And God has shown that he can restore you, heal you, and he will forgive you.
Yes, he will. He will forgive you. Amen. Where the Lord showed up in her life was in that moment where she had no other option but surrender. And how often is that true for you and me? It's when we've come to that point where there is no other possible way we can carry the ball, and we're in a position of total surrender, that the Lord in his grace and mercy, he carries us. And that's how we meet Jesus, by the way. If you're in here and you're thinking, I've known of Jesus, kind of like Jenna's story, you know of Jesus, but you haven't put your trust in Jesus. The way that you place your trust in Jesus is to say, I surrender doing it on my own strength. I now trust in a foreign strength. I trust in a foreign name. I trust in the name above all names, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ. That is how you and I meet Jesus. That's how you and I walk with Jesus. And if that's you today and you're far from him, right now you can meet him by crying out his name, confessing him as King and Lord. And he is faithful to save. There's not a self-effort project you and I can do to ever be enough. And the way that we walk forward with Jesus once we're saved is still surrender. Here's my challenges for us, Flatiron, this morning. Number one, I would like you to read Galatians 2:20. I've got it on the screen behind me. It's one of those verses that will remind you, dear brother and sister, whose you are and by whose strength you live. It will remind you how the path forward is an alien righteousness and it's an alien strength. Second thing I want you to do is I want you to pray this prayer to live surrendered. And I'm telling you right now, when you pray that prayer, stuff's going to start shaking. Because there's things in your life that you're holding on to, that the Lord is saying, it's holding on to you. Lastly, as we go into our response time, I want you to have this question on your mind and on your heart. Where is God calling you to surrender now? Where is he saying, hey, this piece right here, it's time to let it go. And it's time to let me provide. Give us some time to process with the Lord. You can write on the Connect card if you have a prayer that comes out of this. But let's take some time before him in response.